So the first thing I'll be doing before I can actually glue the fletchings onto the shaft is I'll be wrapping the arrow shaft, because obviously the fletchings glue onto the wrap, so I have to do that first. And for doing that, I'll be using my arrow wrapping jig. And of course, you don't need an arrow wrapping jig to apply arrow wraps to arrow shafts, but I'm not very good at making sure that things are straight, so I thought it would probably be beneficial for me to have one anyway. And they seemed a bit overpriced for what they are, so I decided to make one. This is well, I don't know really, I found it in my box of scrap metal, and that's some foam, like what you make live action roleplay weapons out of. I can't remember what it's called, I'll put it on the screen. So my general plan is to stick the foam onto this, and I'll stick it on the flat side because otherwise I'll have sticky bits showing through the holes. That's probably about the longest arrow wrap I'll ever use, so I'll cut the foam between those holes and use double-sided sticky tape, and that should work. And there is so much desk clutter. This is a bit I hate about double-sided sticky tape. There we go. And with any luck, that will work quite nicely. So now you've seen how to make the arrow wrapping jig, I'll show you how to use it. Now what I've done is I've put a mark on the jig, and the mark will show me where to put the label. And then the edge of the foam will show me where to put the gap between the shaft of the arrow and the nock. Now that's because the fletchings will sit just about in the middle of the arrow wrap, and you need enough room between the end of the fletchings. It'd be that way round. You need enough room between the end of the fletchings and the nock to hold the arrow with your fingers without damaging the fletchings, which is usually about 1 inch. So the distance between the end of the label and the start of the nock is about 3/4. So long as it's the same on all the arrows, it'll look okay. First thing I'll do is I'll make sure that I have a knife, and I'll decide which way round I want it to go. Now I think I'm going to put the thick lines closest to the nock end of the arrow and the thin lines closest to the point, because it just sort of seems like that will look better. Personal preference. So I'll peel that off. And I'll lie it down on there, sticky side up. And this is kind of tricky, but you have to try not to get fingerprints in it, because you'll see those. And then you have to position it so that the edge of the label is at that line, and that it's definitely up against the back or it won't be straight. So there we go. The label is up against the back edge of that, and the end of it is at my line. So I'll carefully leave it exactly where it is. Now there's a lump on the side of the nock, which is so that you can feel which way round the arrow is. If I put the lump on the side of the nock against the back of the jig, then the arrow won't come down onto the label straight, so I've got to make sure it's that way round. And then I will push the arrow up against the back and slide it down in the correct location. And then, with any luck, it will have stuck straight onto the arrow, like that. So now I'll just press it down so that there isn't like a loose tail end on there, and then I'll put it back on the foam and I'll roll it towards myself to stick it all the way around. And it looks straight to me. If it's correctly straight, you shouldn't be able to see any step on the stripes where the divide is. There we go. For my 3 colours, I'll be using 2 brown fletchings and a orange one. Now, that camera isn't very good at colour definition, so you probably can't really see much difference between these. The first thing I'll do before I glue the feathers onto the arrow is, this will make sense. This will make sense probably somewhere near the end of the video, but it will make sense. I'm just going to put a little nick in the feathers like that, so that there's a little triangle at that end and a little flat bit before the start of the feather, and I'm going to do the exact same thing at the other end. And then I'm going to repeat that on the other 3. There we go. Now it's time for the fletching jig. Now, I could show you in depth how to use this, but if you get a fletching jig, it's probably quite likely that it's going to be different to this one. So me showing you exactly how to use this one is probably not going to help you all that much. So what I'll instead do is I'll give you a very brief overview, and then whatever fletching jig you end up with, you can look up how to use it on YouTube, because there are videos of how to use most of the ones that exist. As you turn that, there are notches, so long as you've got it set so that you're on the 3 notches per rotation one. Some of the fletching jigs have different settings for different numbers of fletchings, depending on whether you're doing crossbow bolts or arrows or whatever else. The lump on the nock is going to be on the side where the feather is at 90 degrees to the string. So that's going to be the side that is going to be facing on the outside of the bow so that it doesn't catch the bow. That's how I do arrows. I don't know if that's standard or how anybody else does arrows, but anyway, so what I'm going to make sure is that when the arrow nock is securely clipped into the middle of the fletching jig like that, that it's on the notch which stops with that pointing towards the middle or towards the feather, which is that one. Back to the left-handed, right-handed feathers thing. Left-handed and right-handed feathers promote spin on the arrow in opposite directions. So ideally, if you're fletching, you're going to want the feather to be slightly twisted, say that way or that way, depending on whether it's a left-handed or a right-handed feather. I'll try to find a good diagram of that to put up on the screen. If I can't, I'll see if I can make one, because it's quite important to understand, but it's also really difficult to explain. But the handedness of the feathers that I've got, that's not a word, never mind, requires the feathers to be angled that way. So to more exaggerate that, the feathers are going to be like that compared to the arrow instead of straight. And my fletching jig's got bolts, so I can adjust the angle that the feathers end up at, and that's already set correctly for these arrows. What I'm then going to need to do is work out what height the feather's going to be at. So it's magnetic. I'm going to put the clip on there like that. The feathers are going to be that way round, and I want them to be neatly in the middle of the arrow wrap. The very front of the vein of the feather, which is this white bit on the back, is going to line up with the first line on my arrow wrap. So I am then going to draw a line on my clamp when the clamp's butted up against the bottom, so that it's always in the same place, exactly on that first line on the wrap. I'm really hoping you can see what I'm doing here, because it might not be that obvious or that easy. I've tried to get it at a camera visible angle. I'll carefully put the feather inside the clamp. My clamp's got a screw on it, which is really useful because it makes it a lot easier to get it accurately positioned before it's tightened up. So that is in the correct place according to that little line that I've just drawn. And then I'll let the pressure off, make sure that's loose. Now it's fairly important, because it's pretty much impossible to wipe excess glue off of this, to use as little glue as you possibly can, which is a lot easier said than done, because any excess glue will squeeze out the edge and it will glue your feather onto your clamp, which is very annoying, but I'll try my best. Of course you need enough glue for it to stick, but you don't want too much. Now I will carefully stick that onto the magnet, slide it down to the end, and then position it to match up with the arrow. And press it on, kind of gently but firmly, but the most important thing is that there's an even pressure at that end compared to that end, otherwise you'll end up with one end starting to lift off. That'll do. Now I wait for it to dry. If you're using plastic arrow vanes, they dry very quickly, but feathers dry very slowly, so generally this is going to take 10 to 15 minutes, which when you have to do it 3 times per arrow and you're doing 6 or 8 arrows takes an annoyingly long time. But because of the magic of video editing, you can see it much quicker than that. I'll be back when it's dry. And I'm back after however long it took the glue to dry, and then 4 hours for my camera to charge up. So this is the advantage of the screw, it makes it a lot easier to get that off the arrow, because now all I need to do is tighten that down. That opens up the clamp, and then you can slide it away carefully. And the glue hasn't stuck to the clamp, so that's all good. That is the first fletching done. So now I just need to repeat the process twice, but in the other colour, and we should be good. Well, that's not bad. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned doing something about the fact that that happened in the last archery video I made. Now, quite a few people said in the comments, and they're quite correct, that the best thing you can do about that is to put a little dab of glue on the front of each of the fletchings so that it gives it more strength. And I did actually do that on these arrows, but it didn't work. And it honestly didn't work because these arrows are worn out, which is probably why it happened. But I'm going to be trying something else to prevent that from happening. I'm hoping that my idea will also prevent the arrow fletchings themselves from being sharp at the start, which obviously hurts your hands. My idea, which was why I cut the edges of the feather so that there's a flat bit at the start and at the end, was to just wrap some sinew round it tightly, and then it should be tied on at the beginning. I don't know if the weight of this will cause a problem to the arrow, but we'll see. I think I'll cut it off first, it'll make things a bit easier. I don't know how much I'm going to need, probably about that much. So strands of sinew usually have a direction, so they're like thinner on one side than they are on the other. So I'm trying to keep it flat so that it forms like a tight wrap without any unevenness in it, and then it should be quite good, I hope. This is, as you can probably guess, highly experimental. So to finish that off, I'm going to wrap it round one loop and then thread it through the hole like that, and then pull it nice and tight with a pair of pliers. I would probably recommend using a normal sized knife for that, is probably going to be easier. Or a pair of scissors or something, but my desk's too messy to find that again. So now I'll do exactly the same at the other end. There we go, all finished. Alright, so that works actually quite well. I have quite a nice looking arrow here, even though it's very basically done, and it, to be honest, really looks and feels like it could do with some varnish or something, but I don't have anything to do that with, so it'll just have to stay as it is. Now I've just got to make more of them, and then we'll go straight to the range to try them out. And we're back to the traditional road noise of the archery range. Sorry about that. Let's see if these arrows work. Now I'm expecting them to be completely different to my other arrows because they weigh about twice as much. So if I actually hit the target this time, then I'm obviously the world's best archer. Let's see. And clearly I'm not the world's best archer. I've actually split the wood on the target there a little bit. Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that was actually felt quite good to shoot. If you remember last time, it cut my hand when I fired the arrows because the edge of the feathers were sharp. So it actually felt like that little wrap of sinew that I did to protect the ends of the feathers from being sharp has actually prevented shooting the arrows from hurting my hand as well. And the feathers stayed on the arrows, so that's also very good. So I'm going to say that that's a success. Let's go down the range and have a look at my first shots. So as you can see, these two are not that bad. They're not far away from the yellow, and this one has made quite a nice big hole in my target. But the arrow doesn't seem to be damaged, so that's a good thing. And there is another thing that I did actually completely forget about when I was making the arrows. I actually completely forgot about cleaning the inside of the tip with a solvent and roughing it with sandpaper before you glue it on, so that the glue has some better friction, so that it sticks better. So if these points come off these arrows, that's why, but they seem to be good so far. Let's fire some more shots. I've been shooting these for quite a while now, and it started to rain, so I'm going to stop. But I can officially say that I'm pleased with the arrows. They're actually very consistent if I make sure that my reference point stays the same, even though it has moved quite a bit from my aluminium arrows, which, as I expected. And they've held up very well. There's no visible damage on them. The tips are still glued, which is a good thing, given that I didn't glue them properly. Well, I lied. The only damage on them is that scrape mark there. I don't know if you can see it in the video. If you can't, I'll put up a photo, which is caused by my first miss when I hit the wood on the target. And I'm actually surprised that the fletching stayed on the arrow when I did that as well. So, yeah. I've got plenty more shafts and I'll definitely be making more of them. So I'd call the traditional arrow making experiment a success. I know that archery videos are quite popular here on YouTube. I was actually thinking of seeing if I can make a book accurate copy of Bard's Black Arrow from The Hobbit, and if you'd be interested in seeing a video on that, let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.